Hi again, everyone. I'm Ollie Matthews. This is the Narcissistic Resistance, and this resistance video is sponsored by contribution from Joan Smith. And here's her story. Dear Ollie, I'm trying to make sense of my childhood, and I'm interested in hearing your insights. I don't remember a lot from my childhood, so I'm going to recount the snippets that I remember. I think it is relevant to my story to start with my mother's childhood that she has relayed to me because my mother was my primary caregiver as a child. My father didn't want children and spent most of his time during my childhood working. He really left child rearing to my mother. My mother told me once that when she told my father she wanted children, my father said he wanted to buy a boat so that he could fish on the ocean instead. My mother said that they got into an argument that ended with my mother throwing her breakfast in my father's face. My mother grew up in the 40s and 50s to a bipolar father and a mother who had to work because the father of the house wasn't able to work due to his mental illness. My grandfather would spend months in a bipolar depression or in a psychiatric hospital for treatment, which included electroshock therapy. My grandfather never was well for good because he would take his bipolar medication, then would insist that he was cured and would stop taking it, which would cause him to slip back into his mental illness. When he was off his medication, my mother remembers him saying one day that she was a wonderful daughter and that the light of his life. The next day he would curse her and tell her she never should have been born. As for my grandmother, she made my mother into a little mother of the house who cleaned and cooked and looked after her father and little sister, while she sold homes that she flipped and worked at a department store as a manager of the women's department. Someone had to work in the family, and my grandfather wasn't always working. Returning to my mother as the little mother of the house if anything wasn't done at home by the time my grandmother came home from work, my mother was beaten. It didn't matter who made the mess. Frequently, it was my mother's younger sister. When my mother asked my aunt to please pick up after herself so that my mother wouldn't be beaten, my aunt's response was to tell my mom to start crying immediately, and grandmother would stop hitting. One day, my mother's younger sister made a mess right before my grandmother was due home, and my mother snapped. She grabbed a kitchen knife to stab my aunt with it. My aunt fled their home and ran down the street with my mother in pursuit. A neighbor grabbed my mother, took the knife, sat my mother in her living room, and asked why she was chasing her little sister down the street with a knife. My mother started crying and explained. The neighbor grabbed my aunt and made her clean up her mess, which my aunt was still cleaning up when my grandmother came home. The neighbor told my grandmother not to beat my mother because this mess didn't belong to her. Well, how about the neighbor tells your mother to just stop beating her children in general? That would have been a good one, good place to start. When my mother and aunt became teenagers, my grandmother would beat her children for smoking. My mother didn't smoke, but my aunt did. To cover her tracks, my aunt would wear my mother's clothing and hang the clothing back in my mother's closet, reeking of cigarette smoke. Then, while my mother was being beaten, my aunt would say nothing, and my grandmother never believed when she said it was my aunt. You know, your mother should have just pulled your aunt out of. See, and there's the problem. There's a younger sibling that has no respect or fear of their older sibling. Okay? Because I had friends whose younger brothers or younger sisters, they ever tried, and they wouldn't do that out of fear. Yeah, I'm going to get beat, but you got to get it worse. You got to get it worse. That's the problem when you're made into a little mother as a child. At 17, my mother married her first husband. Of course she did. Anything to get out from that. The marriage didn't go well. He was emotionally abusive, and they divorced when my mother's father-in-law gave her money to escape to Europe, where my mother lived for 2 years before she returned to the U.S. and filed for divorce. To this day, my mother has fights in her sleep. My father has learned to avoid her arms when she takes a swing at her assailant in her sleep. I'm a pretty violent sleeper as well. My mom is a very religious woman. I didn't like going to church as a child, but nonetheless was well brainwashed by the time I graduated from high school. As a teenager, I complained about going to church on Sunday and youth group on Thursday. My mother by this time had stopped attending church regularly, but would make us go. She would kick my younger brother and I out of the car and drive away. A neighbor would bring us home. I didn't like church because it was one of those black and white thinking, scare 'em straight, fire and brimstone Baptist churches. The church taught that to think about something was sinful as engaging in the act in real life. They also told us that God was going to come like a thief in the night to destroy the world and take the saved with him to heaven. I remember peering through the slats of the mini blinds in my bedroom every morning to see if the world was still there. To my relief, it was, and God wasn't going to judge me that morning. They used to tell the same thing to us in Sunday school. Evil. God knows your thoughts, and he knows if you're just thinking it is as bad as doing it. That's why you have to confess, or you're going to go to hell, where demons with razor sharp teeth are going to tear the flesh from your bones for all eternity. Over and over and over and over. That's your... So yeah, we've all dealt with that. To give you an example of how insidious this church was, I will use the example of unmarried sex. They were against it. If you even had a sexual fantasy as a teenager, you were as guilty of unmarried sex as if you had had it. As a teenager with raging hormones, this message left me frustrated and anxious as I tried to bury my sexual urges. I remember trying to brainstorm strategies for not thinking about sex with a priest at the Catholic high school that I attended. It never worked, but it left me what would you call frigid, and this frigidity lasted into my 20s. I have been reintroduced to ex-boyfriends from that time, and one of the things that they want to know 20 years after we dated was, did I ever loosen up and have sex? I have, and it took into my 30s before I became comfortable with sex. After they expressed their happiness that I overcame my upbringing, they revealed to me that when we dated, they either, one, felt like they were raping me, or two, thought that I was a closeted lesbian. Neither is true, but it speaks to how much I was beaten down mentally by this church. And it's just narcissism in general. I can't tell you how many women have that, where their femininity and their attachment or their ability to even have sex is completely stolen away, to the point where, I've heard guys say it's like I'm raping you when we have sex, or they've been told that by their significant others, that they feel like it's like a rape when they have sex, or they think that they're just a closeted lesbian. So it's very common thing I hear. My mother was completely on board with this mental abuse to my sense of sexuality. I had terrible acne as a teenager, and my peers would bully me for having a pizza face. The pressure from the ingrown pimples and the regular pimples was so bad that I would pick at them to relieve the pressure. One day, the school nurse pulled my mother inside and asked her to please take me to the doctor. My mother did, and the doctor tried a variety of methods, but nothing worked until the last resort, which was to put me on birth control and regulate my hormones. At that suggestion, my treatment ended because my mother was convinced by popular thinking of the time that if I took birth control, I would have sex. I begged her to let me take the birth control and told her I didn't have any interest in anyone, to no avail. I had to endure the teasing and bullying from my peers until I grew up and went to the dermatologist for prescription birth control and discovered monthly facials to clean out my pores. So she got 2-for-1 deal there, your mother. Not only did she get to force feed her religion down your throat, she got to keep you in a medical state that you couldn't have. So it was a double win. When the narcissist could take out two birds with one stone. My mother had a weird need for me to remain a little girl for as long as possible. Sex was part of it, but it was also my clothing. My mother would dress me like a 4-year-old going to church on Easter Sunday for as long as possible. All All of the way to ninth grade, when I no longer was short enough to shop in the children's department, I wore pinafores with white stockings and Mary Jane flats. Then I wasn't allowed to wear the clothing of a teenager. I had to dress in business casual attire in school. It sounds like, to me, your mother never got over being the little mother of the house, personally. She liked the dynamic that your grandmother set up for her. She liked it. So she wasn't gonna let you grow up ever. Add in the pizza face, and I stood out from my peers in a bad way. I was mostly bullied or ignored. Occasionally, when I was invited out by one of my peers, my mother placed so many restrictions, I wasn't allowed to go to the majority of the time. If my mother didn't know everyone going out and their parent, I wasn't allowed to go. When a parent said she would meet my mother so I could go out, my mother would refuse to meet her, claiming there wasn't enough time to get to know the parent. My mother always found an excuse. I was able to go to one party during my entire childhood, and that party initially was a no. It was in middle school, and I was friends with this girl briefly. My friend's parent came down the street to confront my mother when she found out I wasn't able to attend. And that's when they get confronted face to face, they will act like you're the person. Oh, no, what do you mean? She wants to go. Oh, yeah. Just like my parents did when they got confronted by my friend's parents. It backed right off. They hate that shit. They hate being confronted by an outsider. They hate it, and they will fold immediately. You'll hear about it after the fact, like I did. When my friend Matt's parents called him, like, what did you tell them? What have you been saying to them? They talked to us like we were shit. That's because you are shit. I remember my friend's mother saying things like, who do you think I have around my house, and who do you think are my child's friends? Then the mother pointed out to my mother that they have known one another for a long enough time to let me go down to their house alone, and that my mother knew her well enough that both women shared carpooling duties to and from ballet practice. Basically, my mother's friend verbally backed my mother into a corner, which is what happens. My mother wasn't able to find a way out, so I was allowed to attend that one party. It was sophomore year of high school. Same year it happened to me. Same year. Maybe it was freshman year. Same year. They weren't going to let me go down to their shore house with them over some bullshit that my mother tried to bully me, on a part-time job, trying to make me go to work on my one day off, and it happened. And my friend got really upset when he saw it all go down, and then my parents try to not let me go. He went and told his parents, like, fuck that. They called up my parents, and they lit him. They lit him up. A year later, my friend and her family moved to the Midwest. No other mothers confronted my mother during my entire childhood. And I bet if they stuck around, it might have been a little easier for you. When it came to school functions like school dances, I wasn't allowed to attend at all. That didn't change. By the time I was a junior and senior in high school and prom came around, I didn't even bother asking if I could attend. I already knew the answer. Jesus. But you were married at 17. And you can't go to your prom? I mean, that must have been a hell of a turnaround. My peers were well into ignoring me by then, and no one asked if I was going to attend. They didn't even bother bullying me anymore. I was a social non-entity by my senior year. I spent most of my lunches sitting at the edge of a group eating or eating alone. I spent a lot of my time alone growing up. I talked to myself in school and outside of it. I didn't have any real friends, so I had imaginary ones. I knew it was crazy, but I couldn't stop because that would mean I was completely alone. I would try to stop my mouth from moving so I didn't look crazy and would carry on conversations in my head, but then I would notice my mouth was moving. No one confronted me about it except for my mother, who would yell at me to stop, then complain when I would go into my room, shut the door, and resume my conversation. I have full out loud conversations. I always have. I always have. And she'll call me on it. She's like, who are you talking? And she'll start laughing. And it's a big joke. And I'm like, I'm not talking to anybody and I hate you. Get out. But it's just something we do. It's just something people who have been narcissistically abused do. It's a soothing, it's a comfort, especially when you're an introvert and alone all the time. I heard my parents once talking about me, otherwise I never heard them discuss it. My family was at a casino in Reno and my dad had taken us out to dinner. I talked to myself all evening. My father wanted to do something about me, like take me to a psychiatrist, but my mother blew him off saying that I was just excited. The imaginary friends disappeared once I grew up and left home and was able to develop enough social skills to establish real friendships with real people. My mother occasionally did choose people to be friends with me, but it never worked out. One group was a prissy group of girls in middle school. I didn't know at the time why my mother chose them, but as an adult, I think I figured it out. These girls were preppy, earned good grades, came from families where parents were local leaders in business, law, or the church. I can see what my mother was trying to do by telling me to be friends with them, but they bullied me rather than befriend me. And when I tried to tell my mother, her response was to try harder to make them like me. I spent 2 years trying to make them like me with zero luck. You never were going to make. The harder you try, the more they were going to push you away. Your mother was just using you as a pawn because she wanted to gain some influence with them. It's not that she didn't want you to have friends. She wanted you to have friends that would benefit her. I sat at the edge of their group at lunch. They never invited me anywhere outside of school, and they teased and mocked me. One of them let new girls to our school know that if these girls friended me, they would spread rumors all over school about me. I can't help but think a normal mother would tell her daughter to get away from them. But my mother thought I wasn't trying hard enough to be liked. No, and this is the cruelty of what girls do to each other. Girls are so much more vicious than men will ever be. Women like to watch each other, like to destroy each other. They like to destroy each other as who they are, their souls, their identity. It is so destructive and it is so cruel. And when it is your mother doing it, I mean, you don't have a chance. You don't have a chance because every woman's going to face these women all over the place regardless. What you would hope is you're not being raised by one of them. After I grew up, my mother revealed to me that the ringleader's mother used to look up my grades and take them home to her daughter, the ringleader. There, the mother would berate her daughter, saying things like, why can't you earn these grades in honors class, or why can't you be as thin as I was in middle school? I asked my mother when she found out about this woman taking copies of my grades home to throw in her daughter's face. My mother knew when I was in middle school being bullied by this girl and her friends. When I asked my mother why she didn't go to the principal because those records are supposed to be confidential, my mother responded with a smirk on her face that a little competition among mothers, it's a good thing. I thought so. It's not about you. It was about your mother shoving it in the other mother's face. This is what I'm talking about with the competition between women. And I found out years later the reason I got bullied had nothing to do with me. It had to do with my old father, my father and my parents causing problems all over town. Nothing to do with me. Had to do with them. I wasn't able to have secret friends at school because my mother volunteered at the school every day, and she came across to my teachers as this sweet, committed mother, so they like her and would share information with her about my life at school, like who were my friends. My mother is very good at coming across as a sweet woman who is victimized, but then she turns around in the name of being a good mother, does things that most parents don't do to their children, like telling her daughter to try harder to get bullies to like her, or dropping her child off at a church that will scare the crap out of her if she so much thinks about doing anything wrong, like having sex before she's married. I knew as a child that I wasn't mentally healthy and that there was something wrong with my family. Other adults would tell me to be calm like an adult or speak to my mother. I would try and my mother wouldn't hear anything I said. Then those well-meaning adults would tell me to write my mother a letter. I tried in high school and my mother brought the letter into my room, showed me the unopened envelope, tore the letter into little pieces and left it on the nightstand before exiting the room. She was silent the entire time. Because she's letting you know there's nothing, I own you, there's nothing you can do. Right there, she's telling you how evil she is. One of the few times I went out to lunch with someone at school, I wouldn't say it counted. This girl and I had nothing to do with one another at school. My mother would drive her home as a favor to her mother. And on Fridays after school, my mom would take us to Coco's restaurant. My mother and this girl spent most of the lunch talking, and I would participate a little in the conversation. Then my mother would take this girl the rest of the way home. I don't remember anything that was said in any of the conversations. Looking back, it seems very strange my mother did this at all. This went on for a year in high school until the girl moved to another school. Other times I was forced to accompany my brother to one of his friends' houses. Usually his friend had a younger sister and I was expected to spend time with the sister. It could be pretty ridiculous because I could be expected to spend time with the kindergarten age kids when I was nearly in middle school. Right, because just like your mother was trying to make you into a little mother like she was. I remember being very bored because of the age differences meant that I didn't have anything in common with these younger girls. I remember trying to stay home and not being allowed, and my mother continued shoving me out of the car door until one of the mothers confronted my mother and to stop using her for free babysitting. Wow. Your mother's just a piece of shit. Wow. So they will get called out. Basically, my brother had mother-approved friends because when mother chose his friends at school, it worked out. Again, they were children from locally prominent families, but my brother managed to make them allies who helped him undermine my mother. For example, my brother had the same music restrictions that I did, but his friends would make him mixtapes and with mother-approved music as the first and last song and contraband in the middle. It never crossed my mind to be so sneaky. I wish I had thought of it. God, what a pain in the ass. Looking back, I also think that my brother being male helped him. My parents could be sexist as hell. For example, when he lost his virginity in high school to a cute redhead who was part of his circle of friends, my parents winked and nodded approvingly at each other. Why did they know? How did they know? Like, what is he telling them? Finally, in my last 2 years in school, I was able to make one friend about whom my mother approved. Her father was a successful businessman. She and I didn't spend time together in school, but she invited me to her house on the weekend when her other friends weren't there. So I guess I still was a social pariah because I was like a secret friend. I didn't care at that point because I was so starved for human interaction. We would listen to heavy metal music and talk about my family and the kids at school. She would assure me that one day when the boys realized Cindy Crawford wasn't jumping out of the poster on the wall to be their girlfriend, that they would notice me. One day she invited me to go to Magic Mountain with two of her friends who didn't attend my school. One of them was a boy and the other one my mother didn't know, so you can imagine my mother's reaction. Hell no. She was convinced we were going to a hotel and have sex with the boy. Jesus Christ, your mother's insane. I didn't even know what a three-way was, and this wouldn't have been a quadruple way. 3 girls and 1 boy if we stopped by a hotel and had sex. So no, nothing was going to happen. The 2 girls weren't even dating this guy. Looking back on the situation as an adult, I would say he would have been friend zoned. I begged and cried and told my mother it was senior year, the last year of childhood, but she still wouldn't let me go. You should have just left. See, by senior year, I just started walking out. But this is why he ended up married at 17. Finally, for the first time in my childhood, my father stepped up and said I was going. I had a good time, but too bad we graduated shortly thereafter. It was like a small taste of what I could have had for a childhood. Getting back to the reality when it came to music and television, my mother was a dictator. I was only allowed to watch G or PG rated movies, and even then my mother accompanied me all the way through high school to the movie theater. She wanted to make sure I didn't skip theaters to watch something R rated, that I wasn't meeting anyone unauthorized at the theater, which was 99% of the students I had ever given her, which was 99% of the students I had met ever given her strict standards on who could be my friend. On television, I was only allowed to watch documentaries on PBS and the news. No sitcoms, no music videos. Sports were allowed, but I was never a big sports fan. Classical music, jazz, or the most saccharine pop music alive, like the songs of Debbie Gibson and Tiffany, were the only musicians I was allowed to hear. A childhood spent in the 70s and 80s with no hair bands, no MTV, no family ties. One of the paragraphs in my letter, the one that my mother tore up in front of me and left on the nightstand, was how the other kids at school are allowed to participate in pop culture, and that is what they discussed at school. Preventing me from listening to any of the music and from watching any of the shows burned bridges that I needed to make friends. I tried to explain to my mother no one at school arrived on Monday morning to discuss the riveting nature of the program Sunday night on PBS. I begged my mother to let me watch one sitcom during the week and a half hour of MTV on the weekend so I could have something to discuss with my peers at school. She said no. She insisted that such things were bad for me and that she would be a bad mother if she allowed them. Understand something, okay? All this shit that she is accusing you of doing, she only knows about them because she did them herself, the lying whore. Okay? I guarantee you your mother's was a lying whore. A lying whore. She knows exactly the damage she's causing. She knows she didn't need your letter. She knows exactly what she was doing. She didn't need it in a letter. Then she told me I wasn't trying hard enough to make friends. At this point, I attended a private Catholic high school, and my class was only 90 students, so I knew everyone. There was no hiding on campus who had a mother like mine that could be my friend at school. When I pointed out this fact to my mother, she would bring up this girl from church whose father was a deacon, who was my band teacher. This girl was homeschooled and only allowed to go to church activities, so her life was even more restricted than mine. When I tried to befriend her, we had nothing in common because she believed everything our church said, that her parents were doing the right thing for her. As her brain washed, as I was by my mother, I wasn't as badly brainwashed as this girl. We were going to be friends. She kept looking like she wanted to punch me when I questioned our church teaching. Looking back, I think my mom wished she was married to this girl's father. As an adult, I've seen my mom have the hots for other uptight, devout married men like him. I told you your mother was a whore. I told you your mother was a whore. Your mother's a whore. Okay? She's a whore. That's why she's projecting all this shit because that's the shit she was doing. She won't guarantee you she wasn't doing half the shit she claimed to be doing as a child. Not half of it. Bullshit. Bullshit. Even the shows I was allowed to watch, like the cartoon Inspector Gadget, my mother would shut off the television with less than a minute left in the show and tell me to do my homework. My complaints fell on deaf ears. To this day, I don't understand why she couldn't let me watch the last few seconds of the shows. So I knew what happened. To torture you. She don't want to torture you. She felt like her childhood was robbed. She wasn't going to let you have it. But in the process of her childhood being robbed, at some point she went out and became a raging fucking whore that she don't want to tell you about. So not only did she go and feel her childhood was ruined, still partied it up at some point, became a whore. Now she wants to ruin every aspect of your life and hide behind religion to do it, and then have the hots for other married men. She is the worst type of fucking whore. When I developed a crush on a cute actor in high school, I managed to sneak some fan photos of him into the bottom of my dresser. I think it was telling that I didn't tape them to my walls. When my mother found the photos, she had some friends over for a visit. She grabbed the photos and ran into the living room with them. I was running after her, trying to retrieve my photos. I don't remember what my mother said, but I remember that my mother giggled and laughed hysterically that I had a crush on an actor. I remember feeling angry and humiliated. I remember my mother's friends staring at her with their mouths open and eyes wide in shock. Right, like why would you make fun? Like that's normal teenager behavior. They were staring at my mother with this expression on their faces, not at me, which leads me to believe that they weren't shocked that I had photos of a cute actor, but they were shocked at my mother's reaction to the photos. Right, it seems like your mother's not very good at covering her bases. Your mother's not very good at hiding what a terrible person she is. When I would do something that my mother didn't want and I didn't respond to her warning, she would hit me. I would have to pull my pants down, lean over the bed, and she would hit me with a belt or wooden spoon until I cried and begged her to stop, or she would slap me hard across the face. Then the next few hours would be spent berating me. I remember telling my mom to stop repeating herself, which was risky because my mom would count it as disrespectful, which could bring more punishment. However, I had enough. My mother would berate me, leave for 15 minutes, return, and repeat the same thing for hours until I cried because I couldn't take it anymore. The infractions could be something as simple as not doing my chores or insisting on being allowed more freedom. I also have snippets of other memories from when I was a pre-kindergarten age. I remember not wanting to eat my cereal because it had become soggy in the milk. My mother insisted that I eat it. When I didn't, my mother dumped it on my head, and I had to live with dried cereal in my hair all day to avoid being hit with a belt or spoon. I remember crying. Another memory I have is running away from my mother as a pre-kindergarten age child, shouting, "No, mommy, no." I think I was avoiding her hitting me again. One more memory is my mother laying on top of me to stop me from moving when I couldn't go to sleep, and my mother wanting to take a nap. I was definitely pre-kindergarten. I might even have been a toddler. I think I was. A final memory of my mother's discipline was the switch, which was a thin branch off a tree. My mom used to hit me with it. I remember going to Yosemite in my parents' RV as a child, and my mom picked up a switch off one of the pine trees to discipline my brother and I and the two dogs that we had. One day we were out. My mother left the switch down where the dogs could reach it. My mom's Dalmatian destroyed that thing. There were tree shreds all over the RV. My parents laughed, and I secretly cheered the dog. Good dog. Speaking of chores, I remember my mom giving my brother and I a long list of chores on weekends, and then if we complained, we would be warned and hit, and then after the hitting came the guilt trips about how hard she worked as a child and how lucky we were. My great-grandparents were farmers, so my mom even pulled out memories of picking cotton in the field in summer. These guilt trips rang hollow by high school. My mother worked hard enough during the week. She worked part-time in the morning and volunteered at our school after work. On the weekend, she would spend most of the day watching television, drinking iced Coca-Colas, or taking a nap, while my brother and I pulled weeds, vacuumed, trimmed bushes, and dusted. The only housework she did was wash clothes, but she had my brother and I fold the clothes, iron them, and put them away in our closets and dressers for the family. So really, she only put the clothes in the washer and dryer and hit start on the machines. Her idea of cooking dinner was to put chicken in a skillet to roast and have us kids pop open a can of corn and a can of green beans to warm up the stove. When my mother added barbecue sauce to the chicken, she didn't take the barbecue brush to spread it out. She left a big fat stripe along the chicken. For breakfast and lunch, my brother and I were on our own. We cooked for ourselves from the time we were 7 years old. Really, my brother and I did a majority of the housework and yard work. Where's your father in all this? I've heard you mention your father once. He was clearly there until you were 17. Where's this bitch-made pussy? Where's this bitch-made pussy getting his nuts stomped on left and right, obviously, in this story? We cooked for ourselves from the time we were 7 years old. Really, and my brother and I did the majority of the housework. Since we have grown up and moved out, my father has a gardener, and the house never looked as good as it did when we were children cleaning it. So again, there's your father. Okay, so where was he in while all this is going on? Allowing it to happen? My mother complains she can't keep up with the housework, and my father needs to hire a housekeeper, which he never does. I should mention that both my parents are retired now. They have oodles of time, but neither of them does it. My mom sits in front of the television all day with her Coca-Cola or takes a nap. My dad plays on the computer and watches television in his man cave. For some reason, they can't be honest with themselves and admit they're lazy. Once as adults, my brother returned home from after the Army to live with my parents while he attended community college under the GI Bill. And at the same time, I had just graduated from college with my bachelor's degree and returned home while I was looking for a job. I remember my mother clapping her hands together with glee that she had her gardener and housekeepers back again. She charged us rent and demanded we clean and do yard work and supplement our rent. I looked in the newspaper one day, and the rent she was charging us was consummate with the rent for a room in our area. She wasn't giving us the parents' discount, and she still wanted us to pull her weeds. She still wanted her weeds pulled and her house vacuumed while she sat watching television with her Coca-Cola. Looking back, I can't believe my brother and I didn't move out together in an apartment, but we didn't. Before I leave the subject of our indentured servitude, I remember my father, while I was still in high school, bragging to his friends. It was a time when some Democratic politicians were being publicly shamed for not paying Social Security taxes on their nannies, gardeners, and housekeepers. My father bragged and laughed that he didn't have to worry about such taxes because he's a Republican. He has children to do the work for free. I don't know what being Republican had to do with any of it, but it seems to be an odd thing to brag about in front of a bunch of your friends. I remember his friends laughing, but some of them with others nervously, like they didn't want to stand out. This letter's getting pretty long, so I'll stop with this memory. I wanted to mention that when it came time for me to apply for college, my mother wanted me to attend UCLA so I could commute on a rideshare van and live at home. The rideshare van was for employees at UCLA, so it left campus for the evening at 6 p.m. There was no way I would be able to have the nightlife that students enjoy in college because I would have to catch the van pool. I didn't drive, so there was no way for me to drive myself to and from school. My mother had finagled me not having a driver's license by saying that they didn't have the money to pay for the insurance. When I told my mother that I couldn't find a high school job, my mother told me that she wanted me to focus on earning good grades. I know all of this was complete bullshit because my father stepped in when my mother allowed my brother to go to prom with a girl from school, and my father insisted that as a boy he needed to pick up his prom date in a car that he drove himself. After my brother's prom ended, he kept his license and drove himself to and from school. No after-school job needed to pay for the insurance since my parents covered it. Yeah, that's how my brother had it too. Don't get me started on my brother. He was allowed to do a lot of things that I wasn't allowed to do. This is a whole nother letter, probably as long as this one. Returning to the subject of my mother's plans for my college education, my mother wanted to kill my social life in college by having me ride the employee van pool to and from school every day. She wouldn't hear of any other plan no matter how much I begged. It didn't cross my mind that at that point I was an adult and can do what I wanted. Before that the thought could cross my mind, my father for the second time in my childhood, stepped in forcefully on my behalf against my mother. He insisted I go to college and live on campus after a day spent at a nearby college taking a tour. My father said he would pay for college, which wasn't entirely true, and I went to school 2.5 hours away. To make sure I didn't go to UCLA, I slipped a note into the application paperwork that told the admissions counselor, that it was my mother, not me, who wanted to attend this college. I remember my mother hyperventilating in the car on the drive up to my first day of college. My dad ignored her as he drove. College and adulthood are another long letter. My mother didn't quit because I graduated and moved 2.5 hours away. She had plans for me. I needed to have a career and a husband that moved me up the socioeconomic ladder, and she would need to be more creative in order to make that happen. In her corner was the brainwashing she had done to me since I was a toddler. As one of my ex-boyfriends who knew me at the time said, "Your mother had you completely bamboozled." Sincerely, Joan Smith. And that's what it is. I mean, your mother is completely, totally full of shit. And I think I crossed up one detail. It was your mother who got married at 17, not you the first time, which would fall into line, which I'm telling you, your mother's full of shit. She accused you of being everything she was because she wanted to keep you as her indentured servant. Period. This is all about her keeping you as an indentured servant. And you know what? Your father liked it for a while until he had the idea of its freedom. But you know what? Your father should have stepped in a long time ago. Long before it ever came to this, your old man should have stepped in and ended this abuse. Just like other people stepped in, they back off. They back off when other people step in. You know, same thing happened to me. You know, and a lot of aspects of your story are very similar to mine. Very similar to mine. So I would like to find out where this all ended up. But this woman was out to destroy you and to keep you an indentured servant. Okay? Understand, she is what she accuses you of. All this stuff about skipping theaters and all, that's all tricks. She got that from herself. She was the one who ended up married at 17 after all this. Come on. There's a lot of holes in her story. A lot of holes. And and the narcissist doesn't like to be challenged from the outside. Period. That's the overriding theme. If you would have talked about this as a child to other people's parents, and other people's parents would have confronted her, your life would have went a lot easier. Because she can't handle they can't handle scrutiny from the outside. That's the ultimate thing. The narcissist can't handle outside scrutiny. Period. So, thank you so much for your contribution and story. I really appreciate it. I hope this helped. Thank you to everybody watching. Please leave any opinions or advice in the comment section below. And again, if you want your story read on the channel, you have a topic you'd like me to cover, a narcissist you'd like to expose, you'd like to set up Skype, a phone call, have a private video made, a Facebook chat, you'd like to sponsor a video like this for someone who needs help and can't afford it, or you'd just like to make a contribution to the channel in general to see it grow and expand and keep it going, because this channel survives 100% on contributions from all of you. Without you, this all goes away. So if you like what you see here, you know what to do with the PayPal and email links in the description box. Also, please like and share this video wherever you can. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't, and be sure to click the subscription bell to be notified of all my video uploads. I'm Ollie Matthews. This has been The Narcissistic Resistance. Take care, everyone. Bye.